So, several years ago, a question said, "What's the purpose of a fighter aircraft?" And people up to that point had given answers like the job of a fighter aircraft was to fly fast, or to turn quickly, or to shoot straight, or do whatever. Colonel Boyd came up with a different answer. He said that the job of a fighter aircraft is to do better than the other guy in a competitive situation. Okay? To survive in a competitive situation where the other guy doesn't. Having figured that out, he then studied dogfights and went from there to reanalyze the entire history of war from the beginning of recorded history, in light of how do you survive in a competitive environment, how do you do better than the other guy in a conflict situation. He's worked out this briefing, which is the most valuable classroom experience I personally have ever had. I can say that I learned more from 8 hours with Colonel John Boyd about political science than I did in 4.5 years at Washington and Lee. And I learned courses 2 or 3 times before I got by. So it's a very, very valuable presentation. Mr. Colonel Boyd's presentation is in demand for 2 reasons. First of all, he's been pushing it on the American defense establishment to get them to ask themselves the question before they build an army or a weapon or whatever, how are we going to succeed in a competitive environment? What is this thing going to do? And secondly, he's been in demand outside the defense community from people who find themselves in competitive environments who also want to figure out how to organize themselves to survive while the other guy does not. And it's in that context that we've invited Colonel Boyd to speak to us today, and this is Colonel John Boyd. Thank you.
One thing I want to point out that Bob pointed out, which is a very important point, is the fact that this is not called patterns of war. Sometimes you know, I tend to see a lot of military history here. It's not called patterns of maneuvers. You see very often in the press that people try to do a recipe for some kind of warfare. And I think we can understand and get into that. One other thing before I get into the presentation, I would like to make a comment. First of all, as I've already indicated, there's a large historical aspect, large historical content here. It's not that I wanted to look at the military per se in very strict sense, but I wanted to use it for conflict in that environment is very sharp, and you bring out some very nice nuances, very nice subtleties, because there's a large body of information experience there to draw. A couple other comments I'd like to make. Now, you already noticed my title. The other comment I'd like to make is that this isn't a recipe or a formula or the way to think about conflict. It is a way. I can't emphasize that enough. You want to give your way as rich as possible, fill up the repertoire, as wide a repertoire as you can. Now, that'll become evident or manifest as we go through the presentation. And the other point is, as I work my way through the presentation, you'll notice that I might discuss some aspect or some phenomenon in a certain way. And then later on, I'll discuss very similar phenomena, but in a different way. In other words, you get a different image. Let me illustrate and show you what I'm getting at. Let's assume that we in this room went through all our life. We only saw pyramids from the sun. I don't know whether experience with pyramids. But we go through life thinking of pyramids and fine. Was that your image or impression of each other? Now, let's take another group, for example. And let's assume that they saw all through their life, whatever, only in the top. So they think it was a triangle, a rectangle, with intersecting diagonals. Then let's say this group got to interact with the other group. You both think the other one was crazy. Because you think about triangles, they think about square. Get your problem. So we'll see why as I work my way through the presentation. I want to look at some phenomena from different vantage points, and you get quite a bit. The key idea is you want to be able to see the top, side, like angles to the inside, then you'll get a rich view of what appears here. So using that as a rather oversimplistic example, in some ways you'll see what is going through this presentation. So you don't come up with what I call the so-called elegant or definitive solution. There are no elegant, there are no definitive solutions. Circumstances other than some other circumstances. And I think our university system, our intellectual community, in some ways, has done a disservice to us by always talking about the so-called definitive solution. In fact, it really turns me off when I read a book and I see the definitive solution. Because then you find out a year later it didn't work. Well, how did it didn't work, then how could it have been so definitive? And so I think all you really want is something that's workable, to be used under the circumstances. Use one more comment before I go into dive into the presentation. You'll also notice, as we work our way through the presentation, that I'll be taking whole and breaking them down to bits and pieces, as you normally call analysis. And then I'll take bits and pieces and reconstruct whole. And so you'll see as we're working our way through the presentation, pulling things apart, putting back together, pulling things apart, putting back together. In other words, an alternative sequence of analyses and synthesis, whereby we're trying to get a richer and richer picture. So we're not only trying to understand what's going on, but we're also trying to evolve a pattern or a framework or image. It might be different. So you'll see as we're working through the presentation. With that, enough said, let's get into the. I move this up. Organized here. We'll work our way through the presentation. Now here's the outline of the presentation. Incidentally, before I get into it, I will be leaving a hard copy of the exact presentation I have here. Black and white hard copy. So a few people don't want to take notes with a couple of sketches and all that. I will leave a hard copy. But here's the outline of the presentation. Point of departure, and as Bob has already indicated to you, point of departure, we start out near your comment. There were certain things that we saw there. I was very deeply involved in the evolution and design of the F-15 lightweight fighter. And when we went through that process, of course, at that time, it was really the first time where we did it on high-speed computers. We could literally allow them to design. At that time, we had a so-called edge technology called IBM 794, later the CDC-63. They're relevant now. At that time, we could literally design all kinds of machines. Well, typically what happens when you go through such a process, people tend to get what I call arrogant, a little bit more confident because they're able to look at things maybe from more vantage points than they could before. And so you tend not to worry too much about the text. But ultimately, you got to submit to the real world. And typically what happens is, some things are right, some things don't work out. And so then what the community likes to do, then they say, well, those are just anomalies. Of course, and you sweep it under the rug because after all, you got to schedule a program. You don't want to interrupt this cash flow. You don't want to interrupt the program. You're trying to push that line. But it's been my experience when you do something like that, these anomalies have a habit of getting what are called fangs. They're very troublesome later on. In many ways, they can clean you up. Many of you people see the footage. Right, put stuff off and later on, it's wiped out. You begin to see these anomalies. You better pay attention, even if you don't understand. That was one of the reasons people didn't understand it. They just wanted to have to go away because they said nobody else understood it. But eventually, people do get understanding. And then you have very straightforward. So that's what happens. The result of that, then, why, of course, this helped me get threw me into what I call historical investigation. Now, you notice the term I use here, historical snapshot. Why, no matter how much history you read, there's always body of work. So you can only look at a certain snapshot form, put it together, and see what you can. And as I've already indicated, it's the longest portion of my presentation. Once again, remember, I'm going through the sequence of analysis and synthesis to try to not only understand what's happening, but cleanly for another impression, to which we'll see what I like to call a lens. As a result of that process, we can evolve or develop what I call categories of cognition. Not static, very dynamic categories. And I'll show you in the next chart what those categories are. And some of you have seen in the newspaper. You don't even realize that there's something. You've seen it in certain places. And you'll see there's some very powerful relationships associated with those particular things. And that's what I will do. That will come later on in the presentation. Remember, we're going to work our way forward to building the pictures so finally we see those categories. And then I go into what I call a super synthesis. In other words, I just grab all this stuff, try to get overall super image or super synthesis of what's going on. So we get a real good lens to it. Now, that gives us a picture. In the next chart, I'll tell you those key things that we're looking for to be in that synthesis. Now, as a result of that, in effect, we do have a new lens. So then I go back to two different instances, look at military history. So I've got different kinds of lenses. Now, I want to look at certain events or certain phenomena that took place. Guess what? You look at the world with one kind of a lens, you get one kind of an image. You look at the world with a different kind of a lens, you get a different kind of an image. And so you see, by looking at the same phenomenon, you draw out different interpretations or different idea of what occurred. Because remember, we're a prisoner of our own images, our own filters, our own views in our mind. We tend to see. We'll look through them in order to interpret that. So we'll do that. Then what I do after I go into what I call a super condensation, rapid pie chart. In other words, they just squeegee everything down. Say, what are those things we really been looking at? I'll show you that. Of course, at this point, you say, well, gee, why don't we throw Boyd out of here and just go to the wrap-up section and save this whole day on the presentation? That's the normal way. But unfortunately, if we did that, and I showed you the wrap-up at first, it wouldn't have much meaning to you. Because remember, the meaning was built up by going through this. And you're looking at it from a different frame of reference. You see those words, you say, you don't understand English. You say, what is all that? So we've got to build up. In other words, that's the right of passage here to be. You'll see that. Then you have to go through, you say, yeah, these are very significant. These are the kind of things you have to pay attention to. At least you're going to have this sort of impression through which you're going to view the world competition. Now you'll notice I have another term down here called epilogue. Well, as I went through the presentation, I became a little bit unsettled. Because unconsciously or consciously, or in a sort of a subdued sense, I was juxtapositioning the ideas that I was trickling out versus the so-called principle of order, or those things are really grounded in stone. These things don't look quite the same. So what I'm going to do in the epilogue, I'm going to take on the principle of order. You'll notice as I work my way through, I'll have some rather sharp comments about the principle of order, and you'll see why I think of which caused me to really go back and look at it. Go ahead.
You might tell us, are you going to tell us the principle?
Oh yeah, we'll get it. I'll show you what the principles are. And what you're going to find out, the problem is there is no one set of principles. Different countries have different principles. So that right there should tell you something. And then some countries don't even have them. And they're not necessarily not successful. So we want to keep that in mind. Yet we have this august plot in this country, the high priests don't want to let those principles work out. Remember, you don't want to be a mastodon. There are no mastodons left on the earth. At least we don't think so. Of course, some of you people say, well, we still got a few in some of our parties. But nevertheless, we have some over Pentagon, too. But I'm trying to point that out. You don't want to hold on things too tightly so you can't see the world through a different angle. That doesn't mean you want to throw all your traditions out either. Or the body experience. Now, the sources I won't brief off. You'll see those in the back of the sources. So with that in mind, let's start hopping through our presentation. Now, this is what I call a focus and direction presentation to kind of give you a little quick overview of what we're doing. And the actual immediate mission of what we're trying to do. One, what we want to do is what I call make manifest and make evident this aspect of conflict: moral, mental, and physical conflict. In other words, you can think of these three categories of conflict: moral, mental, physical. We're going to talk about three categories. Now, many of you have heard Napoleon's famous statement: the moral is to the physical, the moral is to the material, as 3 to 1. Well, whether it was 3 to 1 or 10 to 1 or not, that's not the point he's trying to make. He said it's more important than the physical aspect. You draw a great deal more leverage out of it. Like what we want to do, we see that nice statement, we want to put flesh around it. What are we really talking about when we're talking about we have moral strength, we have moral authority, we have moral value, how we can use those concepts. So we get that moral leverage. We're going to put flesh around it. We're going to work our way through that. We're work our way toward yourself in the presentation. Now, as it turns out, since we start melee-air combat, we'll be primarily starting on the mental system. Fighter pilots, one working against the other, is very much of a mental team. And then as we start looking back at military history, we'll pick up the physical early military history. And then we'll start weaving them together. Start letting one interact with the other. Then when we get back to categories of conflict, we're going to go specifically look at those kinds of things and draw out, I like to think of rather important features. Things you really want to think of. The next point, you know what I'm referring to here, or we call it bullets, I don't know if you call it or not. Pattern for successful operation. What I'm referring to here is, if we're going to be in a competitive or a conflict or an adversarial relationship here, what are those kinds of things that we can do to gain leverage over our adversary, or likewise deprive him or deny him leverage against us? So of course that word leverage is nice. What do we mean by leverage? Well, that'll become evident as we go through the presentation. Not only what we mean by leverage, but those things that give you that leverage against somebody, or those things you can do in order to minimize or diminish somebody's leverage against you. We want to understand. Now that's going to come out. In fact, these three things are going to show up in the synthesis. Pattern for successful operation. We're going to build up so we can actually lay that down. Those kinds of things are important. Note the third book. The idea of trying to generalize tactics and strategy. Now, as we work our way through here, you're going to see different tactics, you're going to see different strategies. And you can lay out any number of tactics and strategies for a particular situation. But you'd like to think you could subsume them under more general notions, and it turns out you can't. What are those general notions with which you can subsume those specific tactics, strategies, etc. under that? And you'll see that we can come up with something like that. And we can use it. But before we go into the presentation, I'd like to just make a couple comments. First of all, when we're speaking to tactics and strategy, or when we're discussing it, what are they? And you can think about them in terms of what I call means and ends. You can think of tactics as a execution, activity, dynamics directed towards some end. The end being an aim, a goal, objective, whatever it might be. So in that sense, the tactics is a means towards some end. The means being action of some kind or another. On the other hand, if you think of strategy, you can think in terms of means and ends too. The strategy being the design, the architecture, the scheme, the plan, etc. Also directed towards some end. Once again, aim, goal, objective, whatever it might be. Or another way you can think of the tactics as being a means towards the end. You don't want to get any type of deep loops, because you start closing down too much those definitions, then you exclude possibility. That's one thing you don't want to do in conflict. You want to be able to entertain many possibilities. Because if you avoid your adversary, you can point that out, and then he doesn't know what to do. Panic, chaos, confusion, and disorder start coming to conclusions. So you don't want the definitive relative solution. If the other guy understands what that is, he's going to be able to leverage you. And as you'll see, in that sense, variety is very important. Particularly if you have a wider variety in your adversary in order to deal with it. That's very important at that time. And that's why you don't want to limit yourself to these definitions. Once again, the key idea here is to come up with sort of some general impression, general view of tactics and strategies. In other words, in which you can subsume the other notions of it. And then finally, final bullet here, the idea we call a basis for grand strategy. Now, for the most part, these first three bullets here is what I call destructive behavior, pulling the guy apart so he can't cope, trying to gain leverage over him. You're trying to put him in a confusion disorder, whatever it may be, so he can't cope. You would like to think that should lead to some kind of constructive end or constructive behavior. And in this sense, I tend to use a grand strategy as a connecting link between my destructive behavior on one hand and my constructive behavior on the other. Doesn't mean you have to do it that way. It's sort of a fallout just by the way I went through my investigation. And that'll become evident as we work our way through. And then finally, my intent. Why are we doing all this? Very simple. So we can really understand the nature of conflict, survival, and conquest. Now, when I'm talking about survival and conquest, I'm not literally talking about you trying to take a club and beat your adversary over the head. I'm talking about it can be very soft, it can be intermediate, or it can be very sharp. So it's not just physical, it's moral and mental as well. You can cope with competitive pressure. You can deal with that environment you're trying to deal with. Okay, so that's sort of the character of the presentation. With that in mind, then let's go to our first point in our outline, point of departure area. As I've already indicated, I was very deeply involved in the evolution design of the F-15 and lightweight fighters. As also I've already indicated, we had some problems there. And the key thing is, even though we have all this theory, eventually we have to face up to the real world test, we came up with certain anomalies. We explain those anomalies. It took some time. So I'm just going to give you some insight. One of the, what you'll think is a very trivial statement, but at the time was not when we were investigating. So out of that activity, we came up with this sort of a generalization in a related statement. The fact we needed to fight, and I'll explain these terms in a minute. They can both lose energy, gain energy more quickly without turning an engine. So before we can deal with that statement, what do I mean by energy? Energy you think of in the sense that I'm using mechanical energy, the sum of your potential and your kinetic energy. Potential being altitude, kinetic being airspeed. The point being is if I'm going to maneuver somewhere and I'm going to gain energy, I either have to gain altitude, airspeed, or some combination thereof. If I'm going to lose energy, I'm going to have to lose altitude, airspeed, or some combination thereof. And the reason why we use energy is because it shows you the relationship between these two kinds of things, or two kinds of things we describe as altitude and airspeed. That's why it's very convenient, very useful in that sense. You say, well, my God, that's sort of a trivial statement. Well, a few years ago, it wasn't. Because the general perception then was you wanted to gain or conserve energy while trying to outturn an adversary. That doesn't say conserve. You might want to pump it out at an extraordinary amount, not for maybe too long a time. remember very vividly when I grilled some of the fighter pilots when we ran these tests, the lightweight fighters against other adversaries. This one pilot said, I really didn't want to lose that energy. I was trying to do something else, but I still won it. I said, well, then it had value when you pumped it out. So even they were tending to fight. I said, you really want to reflect upon it. When you lost it, a desirable result, in other words, come out on top. Engagement. So it even took some time for people who were so-called experts in fighter combat to gain a feel and acceptance of that idea. Very often happens. So that was one of the things. So we found that out, and of course that's the thing that you'll see that's led me into, drove me to the whole pattern of conflict we're getting into right now. In other words, the pilots also said other kinds of things. In other words, they said what they really wanted was an airplane whereby they could dominate the circumstances of engagement. In other words, they could pick the engagement officer when they go to the if they could tell a designer that, he doesn't know. They think but they go on. They become more specific. They say, in a sense, they want a fighter wherein they can either force an overshoot by an attacker or stay inside a hard-turning defense. Let me explain to you what I mean by overshoot. Let me use my hands as a fighter pilot. If I'm going to make an attack upon somebody, the guy bends the airplane very hard, then I'm forced to overshoot his flight path, and he can come in behind me, and I'm in a bad position. Or contrary-wise, if I'm on the defensive, what I want to do is force the guy to go overshoot my flight path so I can slide in behind him and take him out. What we call sort of the classic maneuver. All your things you're doing is to try to get in that position. So in the offensive, you don't want to be forcing you overshoot. On the defense, you deliberately want to get that overshoot. So if you think about that, we see the spatial relationship. In some sense, in a very general sense, you want to force your adversary in a wider maneuver space than you are, so you can get inside. In other words, you want to get inside his maneuver space so you can gain leverage on him. In this specific instance, we're going to generalize this. Now, as it turns out, in order to make those hard maneuvers, that's not an easy the maneuver may be easy, but then the drag goes up enormously above the thrust of the engine. When drag goes up above thrust, you have to lose altitude, airspeed, or some combination thereof. And you bend those airplanes so hard, build the drag up so high, you just literally go down almost like an OODA elevator. You lose energy very quickly and spiral yourself right to the ground. Well, a pilot's not going to do that, for one thing. And the other thing is, remember, it's not just a dual one-on-one. There's other people working in the weeds up there. And so when you're trying to work against somebody else will try to blindside you and take you out. So the point is, you don't want to engage too long with anybody. You want to get in, do the job, get out, get in, do the job, get out, because when you're working on somebody may be working on you. In other words, it's not healthy to get what we call tunnel vision and keep your eyes on one guy up there because somebody else is going to take you out. That's where the word comes from, tunnel vision. You've probably heard that term, fighter pilots don't get tunnel vision. You've got to stay alert all the time. So you don't want to get wrapped up too long. You want to get your feet and engagement short. Well, if you think about that, you're getting these very hard maneuvers, but you're doing them for very short intervals of time. So they're very jerky, they're very hoppy, they're very skippy. So you got a space problem, you got a time problem. Jerky maneuvers of time, space. We call that transient. In other words, they're very fleeting. You know, notice underline the term, fast transient, double underline. Maneuver. In which we're trying to get inside our adversary's maneuver space or deny him that same opportunity against us, and we're going to do this over very short intervals of time so we don't get blindsided by somebody else. In other words, so in some sense that gives a basis for controlling the engagement opportunity. We call it fast transient. Now, if you think about that from when you say, that's a very specific situation, that's just for air-to-air combat. But then the idea begins to occur to you and say, well, gee, very sharp turning or hoppy, skippy, jumpy kind of things in life could be useful maybe in other kinds of competitive behavior where a guy can't get an image or a picture of what's going on. In other words, can we generalize or can we expand upon that idea? And if we do, where does that go? That's exactly what we're going to do right now. So with that in mind, let's expand upon that idea of fast training. So we begin to think about, instead of treating a very specific instance, we want to generalize. Expand. In some sense, what we're saying, then, in some way, we want to operate at a faster temporal rhythm than our adversary. Expand it out. I'm not talking about this physically. You'll see later on, morally, mentally, and physically. Right now, we showed you sort of physical. Let's pin that down a bit. What we're really saying, better yet, I'd say what I really want to do is get inside my adversary's observation, orientation, decision, action, time cycle, or loop. Or we'll show you later on, time cycles or loops. Or loops. Say again? Right. Exactly right. We want to pin things down. Got to get inside his mind. Look right inside. Right. But let's examine this. What are we really referring to? As individuals here, we have to observe what's going on out there. In other words, with our eyeballs, or get somebody else's observation, or we, in a warfare sense, modern electromechanical equipment, or if you're in intelligence business, eavesdropping equipment, etc. You're gathering all that information from all the different sources. You literally then pump that information into your brain. What happens then when you pump that information into your brain? You start generating images, views, impressions, etc. What I call orientation. That orients you to what's going on. You start putting it all together. You get an orientation. Out of that orientation, possibilities begin to suggest themselves. And you have to pick, choose, or as I say, decide here on those possibilities. You can't do them all. You say, okay, I'm going to go for these or that. You make that decision. Then you have to implement that decision or take the action. Then you have to observe the consequences of that action, and you roll back to that loop again. Not only the consequences of that action, you're also doing what? You're drawing in peripheral information at the same time. And you roll through that loop. Well, guess what? All human beings, we all do. Our adversaries do. We do. But no, when I said we want to get inside his loop, in other words, we want to be able to roll through that at a faster tempo or a faster pace than he can. And why do we want to do this? That's why I'm stating. Because if we can do that, we will then begin to appear ambiguous or unpredictable to him. Not only that, we can generate confusion, disorder in his system, our adversary's system. Now let's get a deeper sense of that why I have to double check. Because if you can do that, he will be unable to generate those appropriate images or pictures that agree with that unfolding phenomenon. Both menacing and fascinating. No, I got them both underlined. Menacing and fascinating. If it's not menacing, you don't have to pay attention to it. But if I put a gun in his head, you've got to pay attention to it. Whether it be physical, moral, or mental. And when I'm talking about menacing, you don't have to just kill him, as long as you can threaten something that's of value to him. That's of value to him. It all has to be value. Whether it's position, a pecking order, respect from his peers, or his life, whatever it may be. As long as it's value to him, you've got to play the game. Competitive situation. In that sense, both menacing and fascinating. So basically, if you look at this double dash system, after the double dash, what am I really saying here? In some sense, what you're really trying to do is generate a mismatch between that which he perceives and that which he must react or adapt to. So therefore, if I can work my way through the loops faster than he can or get inside his loop, then we generate those mismatches. I'm going to give you a field. Let me illustrate. Give you a field. It's a very important point. Let's assume we in this room are going to go up against some adversaries or some other group of adversaries, which you people eventually will be doing here. Clearly. Okay, now let's assume, for the sake of the academic argument, that we can operate that faster tempo or pace. In other words, we can get inside his loop. In fact, we call them OODA, O-O-D-A, OODA loops. You'll hear that term, O-O-D-A, OODA loops. So let's assume we can get inside his OODA loop. What does that mean? If he goes to make a move, we adjust inside that move, so his move now is no longer relevant. If he tries to re-move, we adjust again, it's no longer relevant. Well, after a couple of those, he's going to notice he's losing out. In other words, he's going further and further away from his goal. We're also going to notice we're going further and further closer to our goal. Well, if it's a competitive situation, he values what's going on. What's that going to do to him? Doubt and uncertainty is going to begin to build up in his mind. And if we keep that pace on and don't take the pressure off, we can transform that doubt and uncertainty into confusion and disorder. You've probably seen where people, when pressure starts coming on, they do strange and bizarre things. It makes it even worse unless somebody takes the squeeze off. Now, if you have one group going against another group, and that other group's losing out, whatever it may be, then they start transmitting those doubts, fears, and uncertainties one to the other. So not only confusion, disorder, panic and chaos come out. You can just see it well up. They come panic, they're totally unmoved. Can't function as an organic whole. Not only that, they start pointing fingers at one another because nobody wants to be a failure. That even helps even more. You've never seen that before, have you? Of course you have. You've heard the statement, victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is an orphan. That's what we're talking about. Nobody wants to take the blame. So if you have groups going against one of those doubts and fears begin to well up, you can transform into panic chaos, and I'll show you. So it's a very important idea. Trying to get inside his system. The idea being when you get inside is to generate mismatches between that which he must, what he perceives, and that which he must. Yeah. Okay? So, we have an example. It turns out, I'll show you 3 here. And the first one that came to my mind that threw me into historical investigation was the Blitzkrieg versus the Magellan mentality, 1904. The very first book I picked up. Everybody's talking about the very fast tempo, very fast pace the Germans were going. The French couldn't keep up. Pretty soon, confusion, disorder, panic, chaos came going. I said, that's very impressive. And while I know that happened, because there were so many accounts that depicted that, what I didn't know, what were the internal dynamics associated with the Blitzkrieg that permitted them to do that? One thing to know the result, you literally don't understand the dynamics. Because if you understand the dynamics, maybe you can do it to somebody else, or make it very difficult for somebody else to do it to you. Once again, not just in a physical sense, but also a moral mental sense. So it'd be important to understand that if you can. Now, I'm not going to bring it out here because that's why I went to my historical investigation. Okay, but when we go into that, we'll show you what happened in terms of those Blitzkrieg dynamics and why they're able to get their leverage over their adversary if they can't cope with it. Now, here's one I am very familiar with, the 86 versus the MiG-15, as they were in Korea. Now, typically today, many people, or until very recently, people thought the MiG-15 was a more maneuverable airplane than the 86. That was the general contention, that was the general projection. Well, I will dispel that. I'll show you why. I think it's very compelling and convincing. For one thing, we have a new frame of reference to which we can compare those airplanes. We have the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act. We'll use that frame of reference, we'll put them juxtaposed one against the other and see what happens. So let's take the first O, observation, 86 versus the MiG-15. The MiG-15 was slightly smaller than the 86. So from the size viewpoint, would have an observation advantage over the 86. Might be insignificant, but it's still there. On the other hand, the 86 had what we call a super bubble canopy, the MiG did not. So in terms of the ability to see out, the 86 was much better, and pilots that flew both airplanes commented upon the fact it was easier for an 86 pilot to see a MiG-15 than the other way around. In other words, the ability to see out more than washed away at the small size of this airplane. So from an observation viewpoint, the 86 had the advantage over the MiG-15. Okay, orientation and decision, I'll keep them together. That not only depends upon observations, but it also depends upon your previous experience and training. And if that's pretty bad, then your orientation is going to be screwed up too. You're going to make inappropriate decisions, so your actions can be wrong. Well, we generally accorded our pilots, at least as a corporate group, were better trained and more experienced in combat. Now let's go to the action where this thing really comes out, tends to show the MiG might be better than the 86. If you were to compare the MiG versus the 86, you would find out the MiG-15 could outclimb and out-accelerate the 86 throughout the entire flight envelope, and in some parts by a very significant amount. Outclimb and out-accelerate the F-86. In terms of the ability to sustain a turn, the MiG was also superior to the 86 throughout the entire flight envelope. In terms of the ability to go what we call instantaneous, or up to pitch up or stall in an airplane, there are some areas 86 is better than MiG and vice versa. And then if you were to sort of integrate, pull all that together, you'd say, well, on that basis there, ergo, the MiG-15 is superior to the 86. And on that basis, it's not a bad conclusion. Unfortunately, some things were left out. It turns out the 86 had what we call a super hydraulic flight control system for that time. High-powered hydraulic flight control, just like you have power steering in the car. 2,800 pounds per square inch, so you could just move the stick from one way to the other and make the airplane pop very quickly from one direction to the other and pull back. The MiG did not. The point was, when an 86 got bounced by a MiG, and it would lag a little bit, it could flip-flop its turn quickly the other direction. The MiG took a long while. The 86 would flip-flop its direction again, so it would do a very quick scissor maneuver and just stuff the MiG out front, even though the MiG, for one particular maneuver, could stay behind an 86. An 86 could transition or shift from one maneuver more rapidly than the 86, than the MiG. And so by going these very quick reversals, the MiG couldn't do it. It just stuck them forward. Because remember, you have to overcome those air loads, and the faster you go, the more the air load, the more muscle power you have to use. Well, you have to put a substitute in there. That's called hydraulic power. It's like power steering in a car. Makes it happen. So are we going to say then the ability to roll or roll-pitch combination isn't a part of maneuverability? Well, that's absurd. It certainly is. Well, if that's a part of maneuverability, then how can you say to make it outmaneuver the 86? You can't. The 86 is one. When you look at it in a broader sense. Because it can shift. Its ability to slip into one maneuver or another more readily than me. And the pilots, they noticed certain things would happen. When they began to get leverage over another pilot, his maneuvers tend to get disjointed, bizarre. In fact, they commented upon it. It seemed like their minds were coming unglued. Talk about getting inside minds. They get inside their minds in terms of fear, doubt, that certain guy's going to die. People normally don't take that comment. We're all vulnerable. In fact, you can go back to World War II. There's an account by Don Gentile. He was a P-51 pilot. You might have heard about it. World War II, P-51H over in Europe. He commented upon a couple instances in his life when he was fighting a couple Germans one day. I forget either ME-109s or Fokker 190. But he commented upon the fact that his fights started out, they were pretty equal, but as he began to get leverage, as the other guy's maneuvers became disjointed. One guy literally flew into the ground. Literally just flew right into the ground. And the other guy's maneuver became shot down. And he even made a point. He said he almost could see their minds just coming unglued. Because referring back one day, he wasn't doing so well, and all that started welling up into him, and he had a hard time staying on top of the situation. We're all wrong. Think about your own life. At times, think back at times when you have certain things you want to do, you have time pressure, and it's sort of not sure you're going to make it, and then somebody loads something else on you. Boy, you start getting very nervous. First thing you're trying to do is relieve that pressure so you can get this done and that done. But if you won't relieve it, it's bothersome. Particularly if it's about value. Remember, once it's of value, it's no value. Yep. But if it's one of value, then you got a problem. That's the medicine. So that happens. We've seen it. Okay, the Israeli raid. We're talking about the Entebbe raid in 1976, another example. In and out in 90 minutes, right? 80 odd minutes, troops even knew what hit. The result. So we have a team. And you can think of any others. I'm just laying out for you an example. In any case, if we stitch all that together, we come up with a new conception. Really, it's been there all the time. We just somehow didn't see it. Of conflict. You want to exploit your operations of weapons such that you deliberately generate a rapidly changing environment in terms of quick, clear observations, orientations, decisions, tempo, etc. In other words, you want to compress the time over which you can realize those events. Likewise, what you want to do is you want to inhibit your adversary's capacity to adapt to such an environment. In other words, cloud or distort his observations, screw up his decisions, etc. Warfare, camouflage, spoofing, deception, other kinds of things. Ambiguity. So you want to compress your time, stretch out his time. And that's the idea. Simultaneously do both. Compress own time and stretch out adversary time to generate a favorable mismatch in time and ability to adapt, shape and adapt and change. Remember, you're not only adapting, but you're shaping. Don't just be a reactor. Be a shaper, too. So you're trying to compress your time. You're trying to generate that mismatch in time and ability to shape and adapt and change. Now, if you can realize that idea, then the goal happens almost as a natural consequence. If you realize that, you're going to get this goal almost as a natural consequence. Call it. You'll start to collapse his system in confusion disorder, cause him to over and under react and do crazy kinds of things. Because you not only appear menacing because there's something of value there, but also ambiguous, chaotic, misleading, etc. Competition, adversarial relations. This is more than just war. War, you know, it's not about body count. That's very narrow. It's more than body count. That's why we got screwed up in Vietnam. Worried only about body count. So this is a much more general definition. Apply to war, apply to very soft kinds of things, or intermediate things. Any kind of competitive behavior, whatever it might be. And you see it works on somebody's what? Mind. Right. I'll make some statements later on. It's very important. Okay? This next chart I'll skip, just an example you want to do. And those are sort of the ideas or notions I had in my mind before I dove into my historical investigation. And remember, the reason why I wanted to get into that was because of the Blitzkrieg. I sort of see what's happening here in terms of the results. What were those internal dynamics? Well, as I got into that, I found out in order to understand Blitzkrieg, I had to read military history. To read military history, the reason why I had to do that because Guderian and the others that helped shape the Blitzkrieg would refer to an earlier era of military history, have a one-liner. Well, I didn't know what it meant. I mean, I knew what the words said, but I didn't know the context. So I had to go back and read it. Then when I learned the context, I was okay, I got that, and I had to learn others. Pretty soon, as I'm going through it, I just can't talk about Blitzkrieg. I look at guerrilla warfare, regular warfare, dirty tricks, all the kinds of stuff. War in general, or competition in general. And then it became very evident to me, when you look at that, a statement I'm going to make now, I almost made it a few minutes ago, the statement I'm going to make now, you're going to see I'm going to say it more than once as I go through this presentation, but we still, in some ways, don't understand it. Remember, terrain doesn't wage wars, machines don't wage wars, people do when they use their mind. So if I go after the terrain or the machine, I'm going to have to fight over and over again. But if I go after somebody's mind, then I got the people, then I got the machines, and I got the terrain. And how important is that in a political game? Doesn't count. That's the idea. That in all forms of conflict, different subtleties, different nuances. Very important. I'm going to say it one more time before we get into it. Terrain doesn't wage wars, machines don't wage wars, people do when they use their mind. And I can show you our careerism, in a sense, is related to terrain later on. Different kind of terrain. Think about it. It causes problems. We'll get into that later. So if that's the case, then what are we really referring to here? In some way or another, we're talking about human behavior or human nature. After all, humans are the ones who deal with conflict, competition. So maybe that should be our starting point. So let's go back to the and we're going to get right down to the very simple fundamentals to start this understanding way. First of all, I think we want to survive, otherwise die like a winner. Or as a group, we want to survive. Not only that you want to survive, you tend to want to survive in your own terms. In other words, you don't want to have to survive under onerous circumstances. You want to have some control over your survival, some freedom of action. Well, if you begin to think about that, in some sense, you want to improve your capacity for independent action. Whether you're talking about individuals, groups, nation states, or what have you, or political parties. But it turns out we live in a world of limited resources, not only in terms of physical, skills, talents, the whole 9 yards. So, if we improve our capacity for independent action, and there's limited resources, we're going to tend to deprive somebody of their capacity for independent action. Or if we improve our ability to survive on our own terms, we tend to deny him. Or if we really get sharp, we can make it impossible for him to survive at all. You people don't have, you don't have to worry about survival in your job. Remember, we're not going to talk physical, we're talking about anything of value. So the implication is quite clear. Life is conflict, survival, and conflict. Period. It can be soft, it can be intermediate, it can be sharp. That's the way it is. Remember, World War I was a war to end all wars. That didn't work out too good. World War II, make the world, preserve the world for democracy. That hasn't gone. And I can go on and on. And you people don't have to compete for your particular job anywhere. You give it free lunch. Always. So you not only have conflict, you have survival and conquest in many different modes or nuances. That's what. So, that being the case, it leads me to this comment. If that's the case, we're not only talking about conduct of war, but we can also bring other ideas in, like the theory of natural selection. Now, creationists might not like that too well, but one of the interesting things about the theory of natural selection, some of it's under challenge today too, not all of it, some of it's holding up, is because whether you're talking about war or these ideas of evolution, they impinge very much upon this idea of conflict, struggle, coping, adapting to that. And many different views are brought up. We want to look at those views. Remember, I said we don't want the elegant solution or the definitive solution. We want to look at variety. If our adversary has an elegant solution, we know his plus some other ones, then we have. I'll bring that on a different way to get through it. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you want to accept your adversary's viewpoint. You better understand it. We like the mirror image. You know, we got it right, to hell with them. We're just going to take them out before we get in trouble with it. You have to understand it. I'll make that evidence we get through. Okay, so that's why I want to look through these kinds. And what happens when we do that? I'm going to give you an overall, what I call an overall initial impression here. I'm going to go right back to 400 BC. Initial impression I got out of it after a few years looking. Pretty soon things start ticking off in my head because I'm looking at a lot of data, looking at many different forms. And this is the impression I was left with. I'll let you read it and I'll comment on it. Can you all read that all right? If I get out of your way. Let me talk. You know what I'm referring to under this first couple dash things? Variety and rapidity. To give you a feel for what I'm referring to, why variety and rapidity is important. Let's turn the argument around and say we don't have variety, we can't operate rapidly. What does that mean? That means you lose your ability to adapt, you also become predictable. In conflict, you want to have adaptability and unpredictability. You have no choice. Because if you become predictable and non-adaptable, you lose. Your adversary is the other way around. That's why it's important. That's why those so-called elegant or definitive solutions fall in trouble. Not only that, you have to learn how to work with other people. So you can work as a concerted whole. You have to be able to harmonize your activity or cooperate. If you don't, you can't work together. Everybody has ultimate freedom of action. Then you got a mob, just everything going off in all directions. You can't work. You can't function. So there has to be some kind of things you invoke in order to permit people to focus and bring about that level. We have to harmonize your activity. We'll get into that deeper. And then finally, even if you can operate rapidly with variety and harmonize your activity, you just can't sit there and let the world take care of you. It won't. You have to take initiative. In other words, do you want to be a shaper or do you want to be a reactor? You have to take initiative. This is where the military's got it screwed up. I'll bring out later on. They don't understand this. They get it confused with offensive and defensive. I can take initiative whether I'm in the offense or defense or wherever I am. Those are incorrect terms. Initiative, whether you're moving forward, backwards, sideways, or any direction. As long as you are using the initiative, then you can get that leverage. We'll make that evident as we go through. So what I'm really saying, these are very important qualities. And later on what we'll do, we'll not only bring those out, but we'll show you how they tie together. We mesh them right together with the so-called OODA, how they play together. That will be evident to work our way through the presentation. Okay, with that in mind now, let's step back to the earliest known treatise on war. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. How many people read it? Anybody here? The Art of War. You get some arguments when it was written. Some say 500 BC, some say 300. I added together, divided by 2, and bureaucratically averaged it, came out around 400. I don't know who's right. That's what we call bureaucratic averaging. We get 2 polls, say fine. Add them together, divide by 2, we got it right where we want it. Each guy's got a piece of the action. Okay, in any case, we look at Sun Tzu's Art of War. Here's a theme that begins to unfold. Note that first bullet, harmony. Those people that read it will recall in this very first chapter, what's he talking about? How the citizens have to be in accord with the rulers of the estate. You have to be able to be in accord or harmonize with the rulers of the state. You have to harmonize with one another and also the rulers of the state. Without that, the state can't even go to war. It's the most important thing. Same thing in political parties. What you want to do is get disharmony in the opposite party so you can realize your leverage. So the very first thing you've got to get is get harmony in your operation. get people to work together so you can get that leverage. But Sun Tzu understood that back in BC. That's very. Another thing that literally drips throughout the treatise, OODA, the idea of deception. And more than once he makes the statement, all war is based upon deception, but other kinds of conflict aren't. All war is based upon deception. He says it more than once. Another notion he brings up, the idea of being quick, speedy, or swift, what I call swiftness of action. He said the essence of war is rapidity, swiftness, etc. Also states that more than one. Then he brings in a notion in a very indirect way, which I call fluidity of action, which he brings out in a very metaphorical way. In fact, that's one thing when you first read Sun Tzu, you're not sure what you read. It's metaphors, aphorisms, and analogies. So you say, boy, that was great, what the hell did I read? Some of you pull out, some of you don't get right away, because your Western mind, you're not tuned to it. And one of those is related to what I call fluidity of action. For those people who read it will remember, he made the statement, armies should behave like water going downhill. Go for the weakness, the voids, the fissures, the gaps. Now think about that for a moment. If the armies can behave like water, and if water does that, what he's really saying, in some sense, you want to impose your strength against your adversary's weakness. That's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it, flow or move along paths of least resistance. A third aspect, since you're working in the environment, you want to adapt to that environment. That's what water does. So the three ideas to fluidity of action: strength against weakness, paths of least resistance, and adaptability. But you people in the political party don't want this. Once again, you see all this stuff, it all is very true. Okay, so then you use all these kinds of things here, play them together in order to play what we call in the military the dispersion concentration game. Sometimes you want to be dispersed, it'll become evident later on what it is. Sometimes you want to be concentrated. But you're shifting from dispersion to concentration back and forth. For what reason? That gives you a way of imposing your strength into your adversary's weakness. You always operate in one form, you tend to become predictable. If you're changing that form, then you can impose your strength into his weakness. It's a way of doing it. And why do you do that when you change these things around? You're playing all these things together to effect or to generate what we call surprise and shock. Note, to effect surprise and shock. What do I mean here? I don't surprise you. You don't surprise me. We treat it as an input. I do certain things. And if I'm clever about it, you are surprised. It's a reaction. It's an output. Shock is an output. Or you do things very cleverly as an output, then I become surprised or shocked. Yet you look at some of our military manuals, they treat shock and surprise like it's an input. It's not an input, it's an output. I don't surprise you. You really are surprised by my actions. It's a reaction to you because you can't cope, can't keep up, don't discern what's going on, whatever it might be. You really want to sort that out. You might say, well, this is true. I'll show you later on it isn't. Because once you get that sorted out, then it gives you another way for applying leverage to somebody. Because the question becomes, in what are these different things you do, or how do you play things together in order to get this reaction we call surprise and shock out of our adversary? It becomes very important. We still have a mind, we have shock action, not shock action. You do certain things, you place somebody into a state of shock. If they're in a state of shock, they can't cope, they can't adapt, they become paralyzed, they don't know what to do. And that's essentially it. So this is sort of his theme. Later on we'll define this term, I guess, too. Very carefully. Right now we're just gathering the evidence. And here's his strategy related to this theme. Note the first bullet. Get inside his organization, those strengths, weaknesses, maneuvers, intentions, etc. How does he do that? Simple. Spies, reconnaissance, bribes, every dirty trick we know today he knew back then. Matter of fact, you read his chapter on spying, he talks about double agents. Oh, that's there. What's all that? All those kinds. In other words, you're trying to do what? Understand, know your adversary. Remember his famous statement. Know your enemy, know yourself, win 100 battles. Well, one of the ways to help know your enemy is through this intelligence, reconnaissance, and all these kinds of things, to get inside his mind. You don't mirror image. And remember, in a much deeper sense,